My name is Bill, a 31-year-old working mom. I live with my husband Davy, who's also 31 and holds a regular job, and our 5-year-old daughter Lenny, who's recently turned into quite the chatterbox. We're just an average family, neither rich nor poor, and we get along great. But soon, our peaceful home was about to be disrupted. The storm approaching our home was none other than my mother-in-law. Davy's father had passed away, and his mother lived alone. When we got married, Davy and I had decided not to live with her. It just seemed simpler that way. Davy, being her only child born later in her life, had been married to me for 5 years. His mother-in-law was now getting older, and living alone at her age could be tough and even dangerous. Davy would visit her when he could, but it seemed she was struggling. Seeing my husband trying so hard on his own, I made a decision. If Davy was doing his best, how could I not support him as his wife? So, I gathered my courage and suggested to Davy that we should all live together. He looked surprised and asked, "Are you sure?" Truthfully, I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but I felt something needed to change. Balancing housework, childcare, and my part-time job was already a challenge, and if anything happened to mother-in-law, Davy would be the one to handle it. After discussing these important matters, we began living together. On a spring day with cherry blossoms falling, mother-in-law arrived at our home with tears in her eyes. I had thought living with such a humble woman would be smooth sailing, but I was mistaken. Initially reserved, as days passed, her true colors began to show. She started to torment me. "Bill, this dish is too salty. Can you make it lighter?" When I did, she'd criticize, "Why is it so bland? Are you mocking the elderly? How rude." And that was just the beginning. "Please hand wash all my clothes. They'll get ruined in the machine. They're all expensive, you know," she demanded. When I suggested dry cleaning, she retorted, "That's wasteful. You've lived comfortably thanks to my son, so stop wasting money and start saving." Clearly, she was just trying to annoy me. And that was just the beginner's level. Intermediate level torment went like this. "Bill, are you wearing makeup? It won't help. You're too plain." She'd comment on my appearance despite spending over 2 hours on her own makeup each morning, looking like a different person without it. I respect her desire to look beautiful, but isn't her foundation a bit too pale? I think to myself. What was worse, she threw away my precious makeup set. Nonchalantly, she said, "Makeup won't help you. It's a waste of money. Live without it. I'm the most thoughtful family member. You should be grateful." This relentless torment only occurred when we were alone, always waiting for moments when my husband was away and our daughter was at kindergarten. I didn't want to speak negatively about her to my husband, since she's his mother, but I wished he would listen. After much consideration, I hinted at my frustrations, but it seemed to have little effect. "I'll talk to Mom," he said, attempting to address the situation. However, mother-in-law would cry, claiming I was making things up. At one point, he even accused me of trying to deceive him. Feeling increasingly powerless, I remembered the saying, "Seeing is believing." Deciding to secretly record my interactions with my mother-in-law, I carefully placed the camera. As I pondered this, the torment from my mother-in-law escalated to an advanced level. We had moved in with her in spring, and as summer faded into autumn, one winter day arrived. My husband was away on a business trip, and our daughter was staying with my parents. It was snowing heavily outside. Normally, I would bike to my part-time job, but due to the weather, I walked and returned in the evening. Upon arriving home, I usually cleaned, did laundry, and prepared dinner. However, on this cold winter night with heavy snowfall, hand-washing delicate laundry wasn't ideal. Nevertheless, mother-in-law cheerfully handed me her laundry. "Here's today's laundry. They're delicate, so be sure to hand-wash them," she emphasized, knowing it would irritate me. "I'll wash them with warm water," I started. "No, you can't. The colors will fade and it'll damage them." "Absolutely wash them with cold water," she insisted. Frustrated by her unreasonable demand, I snapped, "This is ridiculous. Why should I hand wash with cold water on such a cold day? If they're that precious, wash them yourself. How dare you expect me to wash with cold water on a day like this?" Mother-in-law stared at me, her face reddening with anger, but I didn't back down. "Why don't you go outside, mother-in-law? You've been indoors all day and probably don't realize how cold and snowy it is. How dare you suggest sending an elderly woman out in this cold?" she retorted. "What kind of daughter-in-law are you? What kind of mother-in-law asks for cold hand-washing on a day like this?" I was ready to confront her fully. I feel bad for my husband, but if we're going to live together, I can't always play the good daughter-in-law, I thought to myself, glaring back at her. Unexpectedly, mother-in-law grabbed my hand, and before I could react, she pushed me out the front door. As I stood shocked, she locked the door behind me. You're not the kind of daughter-in-law I want. Get out. This is my house. You should be the one leaving, she shouted through the door, ignoring my protests. No matter how much, I banged on the door, but there was no response. I was in a bind. I wasn't wearing a coat and didn't have my house keys. Luckily, I had my cell phone in my pocket. I tried calling the house and I could hear the ringtone from the other side of the door, but mother-in-law didn't answer. With no other choice, I called my husband, who was supposed to return from his business trip that day, but he didn't pick up. I sent him a message. Mother-in-law locked me out. It's snowing heavily and I'm freezing. I'm heading to the nearby grocery store for shelter. Please get in touch ASAP. I started my trek to the grocery store. I briefly considered seeking help at a police box, but it was far from here, and with the heavy snow, it would take even longer. The grocery store seemed like the safest option. I hugged myself, trying to stay warm. My breath was visible in the cold, and the snow showed no signs of stopping. The accumulation was making the streets increasingly deserted. Cars, bikes, and pedestrians were nowhere to be seen. After what felt like a long journey, I finally reached the grocery store, only to find a sign saying it was closed due to heavy snow. Disheartened, I realized my only option now was the police box. I wondered how long it would take to walk there in the snow, feeling increasingly desperate. I pressed on, but I could no longer feel my fingers or toes. Checking the time on my phone, an hour had passed since I was locked out. I tried calling home again, but mother-in-law still didn't answer. As I walked through the transformed cityscape, heading for the police box, I suddenly heard a cry for help. Help! I stopped in my tracks. I was near a bridge over a river. I strained my ears and heard it again. Help me! Hurrying towards the sound, I looked down from the bridge. There, in the not-so-deep river, was a woman who had fallen and was calling for assistance. I rushed down the river bank to her. The icy water stung my feet, and the cold was so intense it felt painful, but I managed to reach her. Are you okay? I can't move, it's so cold, she replied weakly. Hang in there, I reassured her, trying to keep calm despite the freezing conditions. The arrival of help seemed to relax her momentarily. She leaned against me and then suddenly lost consciousness. What do I do? This is bad, I muttered to myself. I couldn't feel my hands or feet properly, and they wouldn't move as I wanted them to. Someone help! I shouted desperately, but my cries echoed in vain. I thought it was all over. Then I heard a man's voice. Hey, are you okay? My husband's face came into view, rushing towards me with a panicked expression. I blacked out. When I woke up, I found myself staring at a white ceiling. Bill, are you awake? My husband asked, looking down at me with concern. I realized I was in a hospital. Apparently, he had pulled both the lady and me out of the river and called an ambulance. It had happened yesterday, and I had been asleep ever since. How was your trip? I managed to ask. It went well. I couldn't answer when you called because I was on the bus. I tried calling back when I got to the bus stop, but you didn't pick up. There were no taxis running, so I ran home. I just happened to see you going into the river. What luck! I thought you had jumped in, but it seems it was the lady. According to my husband, the lady that tried to help had jumped into the river in despair. The cold water had shocked her back to reality, and she attempted to get out but couldn't move due to the cold. If we had found her any later, it might have been too late. So, the lady was okay? I asked, feeling relieved. Yes, he nodded. You should rest. You must be exhausted. Comforted by my husband's words, I drifted off to sleep. All the while, my anger towards mother-in-law simmered. A few days passed in the hospital, and I was back to my old self. Standing in front of my home after so long, I froze. Mother-in-law hadn't visited me once while I was hospitalized. Of course, there was no apology. She had locked me out on a snowy night, nearly causing my death. Honestly, I couldn't bear to live with her any longer. Feeling dejected, I opened the front door and stepped outside. To my surprise, mother-in-law was there, deeply apologizing. Belle, I'm so sorry, she said earnestly. What's going on, mother-in-law? I was taken aback by her unexpected apology. I never imagined something like that would happen. I truly regret locking you out. Please forgive me, she pleaded. I was speechless. This was truly unexpected. Mother-in-law continued. I never thought I would say this, but I'm sorry. Suspicious thoughts raced through my mind. Mother-in-law, who had always been aggressive towards me, who had locked me out in the snow. Could this be genuine? What will you do if I don't forgive you? I asked, narrowing my eyes at her. Mother-in-law's hand twitched slightly. I was freezing out there, you know. If my husband hadn't come, who knows what would have happened? Anyone would know what happens if you lock someone out in a snowstorm. If you didn't, does that mean you're not normal? I added sarcastically. Mother-in-law's face turned bright red. What did you just say? You think you can take advantage when someone's being nice? Don't get too cocky. My son said he'd end our living arrangement if I didn't apologize, so I did it. Now that I've apologized, let's forget about the whole locking out incident. Now get back to your chores, she said, her tone shifting abruptly. She had taken the bait so easily. My suspicions only deepened. I smirked, seeing right through mother-in-law's facade. Her remorse was all a lie. People don't change that easily, especially not someone like her. But just as I suspected, she began her antics again. Make sure you hand wash my clothes with warm water, she insisted. Are you still on about that? I retorted, exasperated by her ongoing demands. Only cook what I like. If it's not tasty, I'll throw it away. This is hopeless, absolutely hopeless, I muttered to myself, feeling resigned. She's beyond redemption. I sighed heavily and turned around. Saying all this, my husband, who had been standing nearby out of mother-in-law's sight, spoke up. Davy, her beloved son. What about work? Mother-in-law noticed him and turned towards him. I took the day off to be with Bill, he explained calmly. But Mom, you hadn't changed at all. Davy continued firmly. No, I was just joking, mother-in-law hastily interjected, trying to backtrack. It's not funny at all, Davy said sternly. I told you to genuinely apologize to Belle and never do such things again. But I did apologize, mother-in-law insisted defensively. You were about to revert to your mean self. That was just a joke, Davy countered. That's why it's not funny. I had warned my husband to keep his distance, but mother-in-law's reaction was as expected, if not more dramatic. She desperately tried to justify herself, but I couldn't help laughing. Belle, what's so funny? Mother-in-law asked, puzzled by my reaction. On the other hand, Mom, I'm talking now. Listen to me, Davy asserted calmly. I'm sorry. Even mother-in-law couldn't ignore her beloved son's words. Tearfully she listened as he continued his lecture. Why would you be mean to Belle when she agreed to live with us out of concern for you? I might have gone a bit overboard earlier, but I've never harassed her. I commented on the food's taste, but I just wanted her to know my preferences. I had asked for my clothes to be dry cleaned, but Belle insisted it was a waste and would hand wash them instead. Mother-in-law continued to complain, adding that Belle had thrown away her cosmetics right in front of her. She seemed intent on shifting blame away from herself. Unable to tolerate her denial any longer, I pulled out my phone and played a recording. Today's laundry, it's expensive, so definitely hand wash it. Mother-in-law's voice echoed clearly through the room. She screamed and tried to grab my phone, but I dodged her and continued playing. Definitely wash it with water. You're not the kind of daughter-in-law I want. Get out. The sound of her dragging me out and slamming the door, ignoring my pleas, was all recorded. Every violent action she had taken that day was captured on my phone. I had been secretly recording our conversations for some time now, ensuring I had evidence whenever I interacted with her. Any rebuttal? My husband asked calmly, confronting his mother. Mother-in-law was left speechless, unable to defend herself. Is there anything else to say? I intervened. Yes, this is the end. You've trampled all my feelings of wanting to care for you. I want you to leave. I'm cutting ties. You can live on your own. We won't contact you again. Even if you reach out, we'll ignore it and won't meet. You sold the family home, right? You should have all that money, plus with your pension, you should be fine. We won't help. But wait, Davy. Are you abandoning me? Betraying your only family? Mother-in-law pleaded desperately. You're the one who betrayed us. My husband's voice was firm, leaving mother-in-law sitting there, speechless and defeated. The only sound in the room was the dripping of melted snow from the roof. From that moment on, things moved swiftly. While mother-in-law sat there, lifeless, my husband and I packed her belongings. Her hometown was a 2-hour train ride from our place. She had distant relatives there, but she had been estranged from them for so long that no one would probably care now. She rarely went out when she lived with us, so she likely didn't have any friends. But now, it didn't matter. Bye, Grandma. My daughter waved at mother-in-law, her cheerful gesture devoid of any sadness. Finally, mother-in-law broke down into tears as the taxi carrying her drove off, leaving behind her sobs. I felt nothing as I watched her leave. It was her own doing. With that thought in mind, I entered our home, feeling refreshed. Time passed, and rumors said mother-in-law lived alone in an apartment. We still received calls from her, so she must be alive, but we never met or spoke to her, just as we promised. She would probably live a lonely life, having destroyed the happiness she could have had. While listening to the washing machine, I served tea to an unexpected guest, an elderly woman, the very same lady I had saved on that snowy day. She had been living a lonely life filled with despair, but the cold river water that day had made her want to live a bit longer. My son offered to live with me. That's wonderful. His wife is lovely, she shared, but I didn't want to be a burden, so I decided to move nearby instead. That's nice. I've been lonely since my husband passed away. I thought life had nothing good left, but I was wrong. I replied warmly. I'm glad you realized that. As long as I'm alive, there's hope. Thank you for saving me that day, she said with a grateful smile. I smiled back at her, seeing a lady who had lived her life with determination and had now found happiness. Mother-in-law, on the other hand, had ruined her chance to live with her son and his family. There are so many ways to grow old, and everyone's path is different. Our own attitudes shape whether our later years are happy or sad. Seeing these two elderly women, I had a clearer idea of the kind of future I wanted to ensure, a happy future protecting the peaceful days I have now. I reminded myself of the path I should take.